Hello, my name is Father Nick Monco, and I'm a friar of the Dominican province teaching at Fenwick High School, which I graduated from in 2002, so it's a real privilege to be back. And this is this week's installment of Know Before You Go. And this week is a very important week, so I'll be covering the readings for Easter Sunday. And actually for Easter there are two sets of readings that are available. The first set that I'll talk about is for Easter Sunday itself, on the day of Sunday. And that's typical 3 readings like we normally have at Mass. The first reading is not from the Old Testament but from the Acts of the Apostles, which chronicles the early church and actually occurs after the resurrection. And so in the first reading, Peter is in this big heated discussion about whether or not everyone needs to be circumcised before they're baptized. And in the midst of this discussion, he gives this great proclamation of the resurrection and the work that Christ has done. So that's the first reading for Sunday. That leads then into St. Paul's letter to the Colossians. Now the Colossians were a community that was very divided. Paul had not actually visited there, but he was asked to write a letter about some of the disputes that were going on, and people were getting very distracted by disputes about angels and certain practices and this and that. And in the letter, Paul tries to refocus everything on Christ himself, who is above all the principalities and powers. And so it's a refocusing and a centering on Christ and not so much on disputing about the other things that aren't as important or maybe kind of extraneous. As my father used to say to me all the time, Nick, keep your eye on the donut and not on the hole. And I think that's kind of St. Paul's MO in letter to the Colossians. And then finally from the Gospel of John, there's the account of the resurrection itself. And the resurrection accounts are so important for the Gospels because Christianity and our faith rests on a couple historical facts. There's a lot of great ideas about faith and hope and love and blah, 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 but there are these facts that have to be there. That God became man at Bethlehem, that he died on the cross, and that he rose from the dead. And that's one of those key moments. And so there's this recounting of the finding of the empty tomb from the Gospel of John. So we start, the joy of the resurrection starts with a body that's gone missing, and a body that we now know rose from the dead. So those are the readings from Sunday. Now we have to look at the readings for the Easter Vigil. And these, there are a lot of different options. You can have up to 9 readings, and the first 8 of those each have their own psalm that goes with them afterwards. So it can be quite a long service. But the reason for that is the Easter Vigil is the service of the year. It is the high point of the church's liturgy. It's where we welcome new Christians into the fold, and they receive the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion. So it's this very important night when we commemorate Christ's passage from death into life again as our resurrected Lord. And so what the readings do, 7 from the Old Testament, 1 from the New, and the Gospel, what they do is they take us all through salvation history. So we start with Genesis, creation of the world. There's then later in Genesis, Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And then it goes into a number of the prophets. So there's the prophet Isaiah, who speaks to us of Israel's sin and also the promise of God's faithfulness. And that's expanded on by Baruch, who talks about God's wisdom, that he has this brilliant plan in mind, and that he's calling us back to that, calling us back to the wisdom of God. And then Ezekiel gives the promise of eternal life and the forgiveness of sins. So that's the focus of the Old Testament. And then we move on to the New, St. Paul in his letter to the church at Rome. And this is where Paul talks about applying Christ's resurrection to our own life through baptism, that we are joined with him. And so all the works of the past are leading up to Christ and his resurrection, and Christ and his resurrection becomes part of our own life through the sacrament of baptism. And that leads, of course, into, again, the Gospel reading from the Gospel of St. Mark for the Easter Vigil. Again, another tale of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, that historical fact that gives us hope and gives us joy. So this has been Know Before You Go with Father Nick Monco, and have a very blessed Holy Week and a happy Easter.